consumers. And we all know that there has been a huge increase in excess savings. Here I've taken just the amount of deposits by households over and above the trend line. For the euro area only, I think for the US the picture is similar. And what's interesting I find is there has been a very large excess savings, 40% of GDP almost, if you look at the difference between the two lines, which has now been almost fully reabsorbed. So we had a period there, again, the past might be different from the future. We had a period when there were few financially constrained households, and now we might be getting back to the quote-unquote more normal situation. Okay, the next point is what actually supply shocks are we facing? And here I would like to go into their development, because I think it is not sufficiently recognized that these shocks have been actually exposed temporary. All the models, and of course also the things that the charts which Silvana presented, assume a permanent shock for energy, for example. Natural, because we assume that energy prices follow a random walk. Once they go up, best prediction is they stay. But they have gone up and have come down. You know, the best prediction should be that they stay down. And therefore, I think this has to be taken into account. But, of course, the economic impact could be very different. Again, that's a point Silvana made, depending on where the terms of trade went. And then we have the supply chain shock, which I would argue that it should have been expected ex ante to be temporary, because it was basically a problem of temporary dislocation in supply chains. Here I have given you the one indicator of the Federal Reserve, I believe, where I draw attention to the scale, because there it's in standard deviation. So you have really something exceptional, 4 standard deviations against from the past. But actually my title is wrong there, because supply chain pressures have disappeared. Right? In that sense, we are back to the pre-pandemic normal. So that was something temporary, and the echo effect of that should actually be positive for the future. Now, for energy, I would submit that you should look at 2 prices separately. One is oil price, and of course the second one will be natural gas, I come to that. And the oil price here, I've given you both the prices in the US and in the euro area in national currency, because at times they were very different. You see that in 2008, right, when the dollar price increased a lot, but not the euro price, whereas more recently the difference has been smaller. What I wanted to show with this picture is actually that, of course, you see that price has gone up and down, so the shock has been retraced. The second point is that we are now at a level which we have had in the past several times. We have had these ups and downs in the past, even more extreme to some extent, without inflation. So I think the task for our models and theories is to explain why, with a shock which is very similar to what we had in the past, we have inflation which is not at all similar to the past. And I think that is very important. Of course, what you also see here is, and that comes about in many discussions, what is the baseline? If you take the deepest or the best point for us at the height of the corona crisis, when oil prices went negative, of course we have had a huge shock. But maybe the central banks then should have seen that there was a temporary positive supply shock, right? And should have seen through it. Okay, but whatever, that's the past. Right now, I think we are back in a situation which we cannot claim to be exceptional. On the price of natural gas, it might be difficult to see. You see 2 lines, blue and red, which are very closely correlated. And one is the TTF price, the famous Amsterdam spot price. And the other one, which is following closely, is the Japan-Korea marker. Just to indicate that in Asia, basically the spot price moved 1-to-1 with our European price. And then you see a green line down there, which doesn't budge at all. and that's the happy US, where basically there's too much natural gas, which cannot be exported more quickly enough, and therefore prices will stay down. So that is the picture in terms of energy price. I would claim not really totally exceptional, and most of that already back to normal or pre-pandemic. Now, of course, as Silvana also mentioned, from the point of view of a net energy importer, you then have a negative terms of trade impact, which impacts demand, and then impacts the probability that you have excess demand in the non-tradable sector. For the euro area, I've given you the calculations, which I think representatives of the ECB have also made in the past. So the loss of terms of trade was rather substantial. Whereas for the US, let me perhaps go immediately here, it was of a very different size. Here you see the red line, that's the United States. You see actually that the US has had a major improvement in the terms of trade. So you have, if you want, a temporary supply shock, but at the same time a boost to domestic demand, right, which was an additional factor driving inflation, whereas in our case, the green line, you see how much peak to trough, right, the peak of what was temporary was COVID, there was a deterioration, of which I would say most of it has been traced back. The latest data point is Q1. I bet you if you take Q2 2023, we'll be back to the 101 line, which is the average. So I would say in terms of trade, we have actually come back in Europe. So that brings me to my major issue. How can we explain sticky inflation with shocks which at least exposed were temporary? Right? Temporary supply shocks in Silvana's models and others should leave the price level unaffected in the long run. First goes up and then goes down, right? And we talked about that already last year, right? That supply shocks supposedly have a strong immediate impact on the way up, but why not on the way down? Right? How can we explain that when these shocks are over, probably you have a price level which is 10 to 15 percentage points higher in 2 or 3 years than before the shocks, with energy prices and the global value chains being back to normal. There we must have some asymmetries. And it's not real wage resistance. It's not that nominal wages don't go down because, right, they're very far from being even stable. And then the question is, could expectations be responsible? And that is, of course, where Silvana did a lot of work. I mean, I show you here just to the extent to which this confirms what Silvana said, which is that visible prices, energy prices, this is the HICP energy, drive a lot of the expectations, short-term expectations. I think Ricardo Reis last year already mentioned that if you take the long-term expectations, they're basically uninformative because they're flat. They take their data from the ECB bulletin and say, that's it, what will happen. But if you look at the shorter run variations, here, as I mentioned, we have done a complement to what Silvana did, a similar VAR for the euro area, and I won't go into the details. Some of them are available in the slides which are on the internet, on the website, sorry. But basically, we confirm her findings that inflation expectations follow to a large extent energy price shocks, but also finding that I find interesting that energy price shocks seem to drive ECB policy in the past. Right? If you think about the famous 2011 mistake exposed, that was one of the cases of a temporary supply shock. Okay, let me stop here. My contention is that the major supply shocks which we have seen turned out to have been temporary, and we have to explain why they have had such a sticky impact. And I think only if you feel comfortable with that explanation can we then also set policy and set our expectations. Because a priori, the future, the next 12 months, should be a rerun of the last, with the opposite sign, right? Energy looks good, no longer supply pressures, and so on. And it is with this conundrum that I would like to leave you, and apologies for the 15 minutes overdraft. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation, and I'm sure that now you are burning to ask questions. So let me remind you that you are supposed to raise your hands. But while we collect questions, I would give the floor to Silvana for a comment, response to Daniel's presentation.
Very good, thank you. Fabio, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for the comments, very helpful. So I would briefly comment on a couple of things. I think what this underscores is the importance of understanding the whole input supply chain and how the energy shock transmits through the various sectors in the economy and through these input-output linkages, because even core sectors are very dependent on energy, so we cannot, completely separate. And in this, I want to highlight, on the theoretical side, the work that Elisa Rubo has done on highlighting these input-output linkages, and on the more empirical side, the work that Shebnem Kalem-Lioskan and co-authors, and then in the Geneva report, Veronica Guerrieri and co-authors, highlighting how a temporary shock, by the time it permeates through the rest of the economy, can have a slightly longer lasting. But we haven't seen the end of the story. So the question is how quickly inflation will come back, and so that's the open question. It took a year and a half to go up. How long will it take to go down? And I agree with you that there is more to that than just real resistance. Part of that is a natural process. Those prices, those high energy prices last year are still in the inventories of many companies. And then there's an additional question, of course, that is discussed lively in Europe with profit margins and so on. And just to highlight, Europe, the Euro area and the UK obviously were exposed to the same shock in a different way than the US. Quantitatively, however, the size of the shock was very different. The cumulative increase in energy prices, retail energy prices in the UK, was 115% at peak. For Europe, for the Euro area, that reached peak at 80%, but then unwound very quickly. In the UK, because of the Ofgem mechanism of price setting, it takes a bit longer for that to unwind, and we've seen the first tranche down, but there's still more to go. In the US, again, it's a very different story because it's not a net importer economy, it's a net exporter on the margin, and energy prices went up only by 30%, and again, reversed very quickly. So these are very, very different shocks, quantitatively, and then qualitatively across the Atlantic. I'll stop there, Fabio, and perhaps we can...
Let me remind you that you should keep your questions within 60 seconds. So I see Volker, then Ricardo, Lucrezia, I saw you, then Lucrezia. And then please ask the floor also from home, don't be shy. Can you please identify yourself?
Yes, Volker Wieland, Goethe University, Frankfurt. Thank you very much. Just, I try to be brief, but I would like to submit a different narrative. All the discussion was about a sequence of energy price shocks. But I think you need to go back to the pandemic, 2020, the policy response, which lasted well into 2022, and then the Ukraine exogenous shock. But if you look at models who combine macro and epidemic modeling, just like Eigenbauer-Bello-Trabant, a new Keynesian model, and you simulate a pandemic, or you study a pandemic, you will find that you can have an 8% of GDP recession with a very mild disinflation impact of 60 basis points. That's because the gap between supply, between potential and GDP is much, much smaller than 8%, about 1%. On top of this, that's what, from that perspective, explains quite well what happened in 2020, namely a very mild disinflationary effect. But then you have a very expansionary policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, unprecedented, lasting well into 2022, all throughout 2021. So you have high demand side support and an endogenous response as the economy recovers and an endogenous rise in energy prices. So the foundation of inflation was laid, in my view, because of that very strong and lasting support. And as luck has it, inflation was at 5-6% at the end of 2021, 2022. Then on top you get a temporary shock like the Ukraine war. But if that story is right, you have to remove that foundation of agri demand, and you cannot wait just for this to go away by itself.
Maybe we take another question, then you will answer both. Ricardo?
Thank you. Ricardo Reis from the London School of Economics. Sylvain, you concluded, and I think I'm reading it right, our understanding of the formation and economic impact of expectation remains limited, suggests caution on policy decisions to rely strong on expectations measures. Going back just an hour ago to Madame Lagarde's speech, she did mention expectations in one paragraph. She also mentioned, and I ask us to replace in that sentence, productivity. Surely our understanding of the formation of productivity and how it evolves quarter to quarter is also very limited, and how it transmits to unit labor costs is very hard. She mentioned profit margins. Boy, there we barely even have a literature where profit margins, markups sometimes go up, sometimes go down. It depends strongly on industry, it depends strongly on sector. And third, wage formation, which continues to be very hard to understand in terms of what we've observed even in the recent past. So when you ask for humility, should I understand that you're asking for humility with regards to all economic indicators? And I think I've covered all. And if I went back yesterday to Gita Gopinath and employment, financial stability, one can also talk about our difficulties in their formation and impact. And therefore to have a much stronger focus instead on inflation, I guess. Or is there something about expectations that led you to highlight that in terms of your talk? Thank you.
So should I respond?
Yes.
So let me start with Ricardo. I mean, definitely, I guess I agree with you that we should be humble in general, and that's why we have big fun charts when we do our inflation projections, and sometimes the numbers, the point estimates are taken literally, and people don't understand the uncertainty surrounding those estimates. Or get too trapped in the exact point estimates without taking into account the probability distribution and the conditionality of many of these forecasts. So I would agree with you. The reason I focus mostly on expectations is because perhaps this is the most uncertain area, because there is a projection forward by actors that perhaps don't have the tools to, perform those projections, and within the whole setting if you think of profit margins, wage formation, I mean, we're seeing it on the ground. It's not a projection. It's something that we can observe more and more in real time. But I agree with you that when we project those forwards, there is ample scope for uncertainty. And same with productivity, and obviously we have a very active field in economics trying to understand productivity and what drives it. My focus on expectations is because it comes mostly in the context of these discussions. But I would fully agree with you that all these other aspects are hugely important. And on Volcker, of course, I am fully aware of what happened. And aggregate demand, the responses of monetary and fiscal policy during the pandemic were extraordinary. We were in extraordinary times. It was once in a lifetime shock. You might question when the support should have stopped or not, but we haven't seen, certainly in Europe, and this is very different again from the US, we haven't seen an expansion in aggregate demand. In the UK in particular, consumption is not back at the level of 2019 pre-COVID. So we're not talking about an overheated demand, we're talking about a severe supply shock that led to a substantial response by policymakers, and then obviously there's a quantitative debate on the size of that response and when to end it, but that's a separate one. For the US, the situation is very different because in the US, as you know, consumption recovered to pre-COVID levels early in 2021, overtook the pre-COVID trend by the middle of 2021. So we've seen really, a boom following COVID. Very, very different from what happened in Europe. The Euro area is still well below the pre-COVID trend. And as I said, the UK is below the pre-COVID level. So it's a very different picture in the jurisdictions.
You want to add a comment?
I think Silvana did a perfect summary. And I think the key point is, as you mentioned, in the euro area, as in the UK, domestic demand doesn't show signs of overboarding and therefore being a driver of inflation. What I would submit is that maybe the delayed effect of the monetary easing still going on in 2021 should have been felt in 2022 and should now be slowly fading out. That could have been one of the additional elements last year.
I already have a long list. I see nobody asking the floor from Zoom. Am I wrong, or I don't see anything on my screen? But anyway, I have on my list, I've certainly forgotten somebody. Lucrezia, Jordi, Robert, Christine, and Tiff. Then we will see. Okay, Lucrezia.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on two important points that Daniel made on oil price. I think you made 2 points. We had similar shock in oil, but in energy, but a very different response from the past on inflation. And the second point is it matters whether the energy shock is temporary or permanent. So I'd like to offer some empirical evidence, which is actually in the Geneva report that we co-authored with Silvana, that in the past, in the euro area, I mean, if you shock the economy with an exogenous oil shock and you look at the general equilibrium effect, actually core inflation reacts with a lag, and from the first shock until it returns to the steady state is about 60 months. So I think that is more or less, so we are still in the norm of what we have seen in the past. And the second thing is that the core is a lagging indicator with respect to headline. So this is a feature that maybe is different in the US economy, but is incredibly robust in the euro economy. So I think it's very important to get these facts straight. Thanks.
Jordi, where are you? There, yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick comment on Danielle's discussion. The fact that real wages have declined somewhat in terms of the GDP deflator, which is a relevant measure, as you said, is not a proof, in my opinion, that there are no real wage rigidities. We don't have a counterfactual. We don't know how much real wages should have gone down in the absence of real wage rigidities. And I would claim that the fact that inflation has gone up that much, in particular GDP deflator inflation, is indirect evidence that real wages didn't go down as much as a model with fully flexible wages would have implied.
You want to answer?
I agree with Lucrezia. And it's part of this input-output diffusion of the shock, and that's what we have in the Geneva report and in previous work that Lucrezia has done. And with Jordi, yes, I agree. I guess it was mostly a comment to Daniel, but there has been, certainly we've seen in the UK, some degree of resistance, and the fact that real wages fell somewhat is not proof that those rigidities are not in certain sectors and certain parts of the economy.
Okay, so. Okay, I have 3 more questions. If you are quick, we can accommodate all 3 and I see other hands, but let's start with Robert, then Christine, then Tiff. Robert. This gentleman here.
Thanks. A very simple question in answer to the question which Daniel posed there. In the US, sir, we had no terms of trade shock, but with a lot of fiscal expansion. In Europe, we had that with a lot of fiscal expansion. And if we put both together, fiscal expansion and high debt plays a role in inflation dynamics. And we just had a paper on the BIS last week by Cochrane about it. So what is part of a unifying explanation why we have this inflation?
Rob, can you pass the mic to Christine? Thank you.
Thank you. Kristen Forbes from MIT. So last night at the dinner speech, Gita raised an uncomfortable truth that central bankers needed to think more carefully about how they responded to supply shocks. This paper is an excellent response, very timely, very quick. But it is very, very nice how it lays out clearly what characteristics of the supply shock determine the optimal response. So I think this is a great resource for central bankers now. But with that in mind, I was wondering if you could talk about how your results would change if you extended the model along two characteristics of the recent supply shock. First, one characteristic of the recent energy shock is that countries have responded with large policy responses, energy price caps, and targeted subsidies, and that has mitigated the impact of the big price rise on demand and inflation. We'll hear more about that in Pierre Olivier's excellent paper tomorrow. But if you then take away some of this effect on consumption and inflation, how does that change? What is the optimal monetary policy response? Second extension, the characteristic of this shock is that the supply shocks were very large. So you can get nonlinear effects, which we'll also hear about later. So if you get nonlinear effects on wage bargaining and price setting, how will that affect your implications for the optimal monetary policy response?
Well, Silvana and Danielle, thank you both for excellent presentations. My question, Silvana, is as you've looked at inflation expectations, what do you think the horizon is that matters the most for monetary policy? I mean, as you showed, longer run expectations have been very well anchored. That's been a great source of comfort to central bankers. But on the other hand, short run expectations have moved around a lot. And going back to President Lagarde's opening remarks, when you think of firms setting their prices, wage bargainers setting their wages, if those short-run expectations are more important for that, the situation might be more complicated. And certainly, at least in the Canadian case, if you look at survey expectations of inflation at the short run, they are above our own forecast. So to put it more provocatively, I mean, are we taking a bit of false comfort that longer-run expectations are well anchored?
John? Last question.
Last year, John Mulbauer, last year I talked about the inadequacy of central bank models, and the chart that Daniel Gross put up of how excess liquidity has evolved post-pandemic and how it's declined since is really important. Differences in household portfolios between the UK and the Eurozone have a huge implication for differences in monetary policy responses and also how the real economy is going to respond. And as Christine Lagarde pointed out yesterday, the difference, actually this morning, the difference between floating rate and fixed rate mortgages, those structural differences, another really important feature that distinguishes the UK from the Eurozone.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start with that last one. John, yes, excess liquidity played a big role in the forecasting models of the bank, and this was a reason why we had very strong demand in the recovery from the pandemic in the projections. My colleague Ben Broadbent has a nice description of the forecast at the time, given that excess savings, and connects to what Daniel discussed, we were expecting a much faster recovery in demand from the COVID pandemic. But then the war hit, and then what we saw is actually we undershot massively because the war represented a big, or led to a big increase in the price of energy, very adverse in terms of trade shock. So that played an important role early on, and as Daniel mentioned, most of those excess savings are now being absorbed. there was a question of what expectations matter, and this is a crucial question. I think when we think about the anchoring, typically we think about longer-term inflation expectations, and that's the focus, and for that we need to resort to markets, but those markets are not the ones involved in the actual pricing decisions of firms. When we think about what determines pricing decisions by firms, well, what's the relevant horizon for them? Our intuition comes from sticky price models, typically, with an average duration of prices of 1 year, then you would think it's 1 year that matters. And that's, a point that Ivan Berning makes very clear in his recent paper, short-time expectations, matter more than those long-term expectations. But obviously, as inflation increases, price flexibility increases. And so, prices become very flexible. At the extreme, those expectations shouldn't matter much. I mean, you're really setting prices based on spot inflation or past inflation. So this, I think, is an important aspect to work through more and, build that connection between academic models and firms' decision and how they switch to these higher levels of flexibility. I think I'm on negative time, but Christine, great points. I mean, obviously, when we, as you know very well, when we do monetary policy, we consider aggregate demand with all its influences, and fiscal is a huge influence in there. And basically, what I'm talking here is the residual shock left after fiscal policy or energy policy have done their jobs. And this is what's left for monetary policy. Obviously, when you're thinking about an energy price shock, monetary policy is not the best and first best response to that. You need an energy policy that would take care ex ante, of course, of anticipating and then mitigating the impact of those shocks through diversification of supply, diversification of trading partners, inventory policies, et cetera, and then comes, the remedies that you can put in place when a shock hits. And once you sort of account for all those, then comes monetary policy and picks up the pieces left. In this case, I mean, it was full exposure to the shock, but in the future, hopefully, if we can address this in advance in different ways, maybe the shock will be less impactful and less work will be left to monetary policy. I don't know if you want me to continue. So many questions. But I guess that connects to Robert's question on fiscal. So I'll stop there.
Okay, just wanted to emphasize, we are not facing at present the tailwind of a permanent shock, but actually we have had over the last 6 months a positive shock. So we should be living in the future. And if we had nonlinear effects in the past on the way up, should there be also nonlinear on the way down? So I come back. I think in the face of temporary shocks, we should look at the question of asymmetry, and that is crucial for understanding of where the economy is going.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think we need now to bring this session to a close. If I had to summarize the main takeaways of this session in one sentence, I think that sentence would be that, unfortunately, there is no shortcut, no intermediate target or single indicator that would allow to simplify decision-making and the calibration of the monetary policy response to multiple supply shocks. And this is, in fact, reflected in the reaction function of the European Central Bank. We have repeatedly emphasized that our monetary policy decisions are determined by our assessment of the medium-term inflation outlook in light of the incoming economic and financial data, the dynamics of underlying inflation, and the strength of the monetary policy transmission. Please join me in thanking Silvana and Daniel for their contributions, and I will now give the floor to my dear friend Frank Elderson, who will moderate the next session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Silvana. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Fabio, for giving me the floor. And esteemed forum participants, Fabio, you left a very engaged audience, so I think that we are in for a good session. Privileged to chair the second session of this year's forum, which is titled Assessing the Costs of Inflation. For a while, high inflation was considered a remnant of the past. Central bankers worried for a long time about inflation that was too low instead of inflation that was too high. How dramatically that picture has changed after the pandemic and the energy crisis, hasn't it? Inflation has been and will continue to be too high for too long, as the president of the ECB reminded us last night. Central banks have responded forcefully to the surge in inflation by moving monetary policy from highly accommodative into restricted territory at an unprecedented pace. Central bankers are very much aware of the disastrous consequences of high inflation, especially to those people that have little income or little wealth to guard against it. We need little more to be reminded of the importance of delivering on our mandate. That being said, the overall macroeconomic welfare implications of inflation shocks are not easy to assess and depend on many factors. The size and persistence of the shock, the way the economy adjusts, the way the burden of an inflation shock is shared. These are all non-trivial considerations for which we need economic modeling and research. In this session, we have a paper by Francesco Lippi, professor of economics at Lewis University, on exactly this topic. Professor Lippi is currently editor-in-chief of the economic journal, the Journal of the Royal Economic Society. He received his PhD from Tinbergen Institute, and I'm glad to be able to say that in Dutch, in Rotterdam in 1997, and he worked in the research department of the Banca d'Italia until 2006. He's a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research and a senior fellow at the Einaudi Institute for Economics and Finance. His research interests lie in the fields of macroeconomics and monetary economics. He has published many papers on the propagation of monetary shocks, technological innovation, and means of payments choices, and monetary and wage-setting institutions. We start this session with Professor Lippi's presentation for about 25 minutes, followed by a 15-minute presentation by our discussant, and I will introduce you in a second chair. Next, we will open the floor for questions and discussion. And at that point in time, online participants wishing to comment or ask questions should be prepared to raise their virtual hands. The online participants were not participating in the discussion in the former session, but please be aware that you are allowed to pitch in as well. But first, let's start without any delay with your presentation, Professor.
All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It is a pleasure and an honor to be giving this talk in front of such a distinguished audience. What I'm going to talk about today is joint work with Alberto Cavallo at Harvard Business School and Ken Miyahara, a very bright student of mine at Lewis University. So We're going to do two things in this paper. We analyze, with some humility, two very difficult questions. The first question is about the propagation of a large cost shock. So I'm putting myself in the shoes of a firm that, in 2020 and 2021 witnesses these very big increases in the energy prices that have been recorded in Europe, and has a problem, has to set prices, and finds itself with profit margins that are shrunk. So somehow something has to be done. So the paper is going to have two angles. One, a question about the propagation, how those shocks propagate, and the second one, what are the welfare costs that this big shock brings about? Now, this is going to be particularly narrow. I'm going to develop the analysis using what I would say is today's dominant paradigm in monetary policy analysis, the new Keynesian model. Alternatives might have been followed, perhaps they'll come up in the discussion. But I'm going to do my analysis within the framework of the new Keynesian paradigm because it is, in my view, by far the dominant paradigm through which monetary policies are studied in central banks. The whole ideas of forward guidance, Phillips curves, they rely on simple models where firms' prices are sticky. They are not where they should be in an ideal frictionless world. And this stickiness creates wedges, what in my notation is going to be a PI, the price of firm I, which is not equal to PI star, the ideal price. These wedges, the bigger they are, the more misallocated resources are. Ideally, we'd like to measure them. Problem is, we don't really observe P star, so we'll have to come up with some tricks. Second, why do we have sticky prices? Well, the assumptions in this model is that resetting prices takes some resources. Firms have to dedicate resources to the price setting activity, and these resources are a bit of a waste, much like the shoe leather cost we had in the old money demand models. So we're going to measure both distortions using a simple model. And as I said, the thought experiment is we'll write down a model for the steady state, for the tranquil decade that preceded the big shocks, the big energy shocks, and then use the model to answer the question, what happens if we hit this economy with a big energy cost shock? And one challenge for us is going to select a model out of the large class of models that can be written down that is satisfactory in terms of fitting key patterns of the data. So let me review quickly what are the key patterns. This one, we can go very fast. Everyone knows on the left panel, you see the big increases of energy prices in Europe. Depending on the measure you take, we could say it's something between 100 and 200%, which my rule of thumb is going to be, as I mentioned, I'm going to give a simple model, so I'm kind of putting my reputation at risk here. I'm going to embrace a simple model and take it seriously. And I want to think that firms' marginal costs, of which energy is an input, shoot up by something like 10, 20%. Firms had to do something. So what did they do? This is a picture constructed on granular data provided by PriceStats, the Billion Prices project that Alberto was a pioneer of. So what you see before 2022, this is a picture for the sector of food and beverages. You see that firms in several European countries in the food and beverage were repricing between 2 to 3 times a year. There's some noise, but it's roughly stable. Frequency of price changes was stable. We were living in a rather stable environment. Then the big shock comes, and what you see an explosion of repricing activities between 2 to 3 times. In France, the average number of price changes goes from 2.4 to 5 or 6. And similarly in many other countries. Now, you might think this must be something special with food and beverages, which indeed are somewhat special. Now, this is a graph I took from a monthly report by the Banque de France, where you see this is for all sectors. It's not just food and beverages. And the blue line is the industry. The orange line is the services. Now, this is also witness to the input-output linkages that have been mentioned before. Things first happen in industry, that then transfer to services. What you see, once again, is that on the vertical axis you have probabilities. So there was an average 1 price change per year in these industries. And following the shock, it jumps up to like 2 times that or 3 times that. So we want to have a model that will capture this because it is a big thing in the data that following a big shock, firms are more active. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a simple model. This is the only slide that's going to have something like an equation that is scary looking, but it's underlying my sort of reasoning and putting some discipline in what I'm going to do. So what are the essential ingredients of this new Keynesian model we write down? And the details are in the paper that is posted online. Firms, a firm I is trying to control this variable X. It's a gap between the actual prices they have and the ideal price they would like to have. This ideal price P star is pushed around by idiosyncratic shocks in normal times. If you look at what firms do in normal times, let's say the decade before the shock, sometimes they have big price increases, big price decreases. We're going to think of these idiosyncratic shocks that hit firms. That's a sigma. That's a sigma that you see there. But then, in my thought experiment, at some point there will be a big, large shock that hits all the firms, and everyone's marginal cost will go up. That's the energy shock. That's common to everyone. That's why it's an aggregate shock. Now, what do firms do? They solve a complicated problem that I took from Caballero and Engel, but in the end, it boils down to a very simple idea. Firms have to solve a problem. Prices are sticky. What does it mean? That blue and red object there is the cost for the firm in terms of foregone resources, foregone profits of controlling their prices. They have to hire someone, their marketing guys, their statisticians say, okay, tell me what the right price should be, tell me what our competitors are doing. So we're going to parameterize that model in a way that captures aspects from the data. And why are the firms wasting these resources? Because they want to have a small x. They want to keep x as close as possible to a good value. This boils down to something like this. The model produces this V-shaped blue function. It's a function that has a very intuitive explanation. It's telling us what firms, the probability that we observe a price change. How does it work? Well, you see the function has a minimum at 0. At 0, firms are happy with their price. P is close to P star. Now, the more P deviates from P star, the more firm is unhappy and it spends more resources such that a price change will occur. Now, it might seem totally natural to you. Typically, we tend to invest more energies into something that is more important to us. It's basic cost-benefit analysis. Yet, I must mention that the textbook version of the sticky price model we use and that I see in several papers is a model that is totally oblivious of this point and assumes that price resetting occurs with some time-dependent probability. Think of Taylor's 1980s, you reprice every T periods, or maybe the recent Calvo version with some probability you do something. Now, that seems like a very bad description. You don't tell this to a businessman because that's not what they do. They think about things to do. Anyway, let's keep that in mind because we're going to use it as a benchmark. Now, one nice feature of this blue line is that we see it in the data. Several people have tried smart ways to measure P and P star and come up with estimates of probabilities to see a price change. And those V-shaped patterns you see in these 3 graphs come from different papers, and they provide us with strong evidence that behavior is, as we say, state-dependent. That the probability to observe a price change depends on where the firm is. Now, why does it matter? So ideally, what we would like to measure, remember, each firm has an x. So this f of x is the cross-sectional distribution of the x's. Ideally, I, Francesco, want to know how efficient is the economy. I want to go out there and measure all the x's. I want to learn about f of x. F of x is not really directly observable. So we have to come up with some tricks to measure something like the variance of f of x. Jordi has a very nice paper where he shows that the consumer's welfare is approximated by up to first order by the variance of those x's. So how do I measure f of x? Well, I have lambda, I have f. A composition of these 2 functions gives us something observable, the distribution of the size of the price changes. It's those blue histograms you see there. The red curve you see in the first one on the left is the prediction for the size of price changes in my model. And the rest is just data. So some things are intuitive. There's very little tiny price changes. Well, there's no reason to have a price change when your price is close to the good one. There's both very big positive and very big negative price changes. That's because of the idiosyncratic shocks. So these are data that we calibrate the model with using these are building blocks of the model that we use to calibrate the model using 3 different data sets. The first one is this very granular, very high frequency daily, actually, food and beverages sector that comes from the Billion Prices project. And what we're going to measure standard deviation of the price changes. That's going to be a proxy for the idiosyncratic shocks, the sigma I mentioned before. If you see an economy where the standard deviation is large, it must be that those firms are hit on average by big idiosyncratic shocks. Big positive, big negative. Now, the frequency is a natural measure of how flexible the economy is. If you see an economy where everything happens, repricing is very high, it must mean that maybe the cost of repricing is not so high, and firms are happy to do it. Kurtosis is a measure, I should have mentioned it. When we look at these distributions, I want to get some information on how thick are the tails of the distribution. If I have a distribution with thick tails, it means that I have some agents in this economy whose gaps are really big. Big positive and big negative. And that's going to be like bad news for efficiency because the costs are non-linear. So having some extreme outliers there is going to be costly for our economy. So I take data both from the price stats data, from recent analysis for the euro area in particular. The data that appear in the bottom panel are data that I obtained from Erwan Gauthier, who coordinated the Prisma data project at the ECB, a major project using CPIs. There's a big difference between those data and the one in the first row. The CPI data are obviously more encompassing. Yet, if you eyeball those numbers, they're not incredibly different. The thickness of the tail is roughly close to that of a normal. The frequency for the overall price index is kind of lower. It's 1 price change per year on average. So what do I do with this data? Well, first, I come up with an idea about, okay, how can I measure? Remember, I want to have some information on the variance of X, that object you see there. Now, that first equation there is something that people in my profession consider a synonym of beauty, because it's an object that allows you to map something unobservable, the variance of X, into something observable. And what's the idea? The idea in the end is very simple. So the first formula, the eta divided by 2 times the variance, comes from Jordi's approximation of the consumer's representative utility. Now, why is the variance proportional to those red objects on the right? I already mentioned a large variance of price changes means that we are looking at an economy in which when we see an agent taking an action, he does something big. So doing something big on average, that's what the variance is telling us, means that on average you're far away from where you want to be. So that's bad news for the welfare. It means variance is high. Now, for a given variance, kurtosis means that you have more agents in those tails, and that's also going to compound to the overall welfare cost. Then the model also allows us to quantify how big are the resources that firms employ in this wasteful price management activity. So when we apply this to the data, and here for simplicity, I'm just using the Prisma data. In the paper we have several countries. What we get is that the misallocation cost, expressed in terms of as a fraction of consumption, the misallocation costs are quite sizable. They amount in the steady state. This is before any shock occurs. I haven't yet told you the interesting part of my story, but it's like 1.5% of GDP. And the price management costs are about 50 basis points. So overall, this simple model, which has many caveats, and I'll be happy to discuss them, is suggesting something like the welfare costs, because of these sticky prices, this is really what is causing these wedges, are